I've called the presentation Raising the Bar and Closing the Gap, which is one of those phrases that's knocked about when we're talking about educational policy. But I mean, in a sort of simple sense, that's why we're here today, to discuss how education systems can be improved for all children, the idea of excellence, raising the bar, if you will, and then at the same time, the concern we have across the United Kingdom about children who get left behind, children who don't do as well out of the way that the systems operate at the moment. And what I propose to do is to give you a brief story of the City Challenge programme in England that the Deputy Minister made reference to. Not to say that there's something here that can just be lifted off the shelf and brought into Wales. Things are much more complex than that, and I'm always sensitive in the work that I've been doing recently in Wales of the fact that, you know, I am an outsider and I don't fully understand the way the system works. I'm telling you a story from another context. I think there are lessons in all of this, as I've suggested, that are worth thinking about as we talk about how the next stage of development of Wales could occur. But these lessons, as I'll describe them to you, are not a series of kind of simple techniques. More, they're a way of thinking about the task, thinking about how do we move an education system forward in relation to raising the bar and closing the gap. The story begins round about 2002 in London, when the Prime Minister then, Tony Blair, and his colleagues, for whatever reason, became very concerned about the performance of secondary schools in the capital. And I guess one of the reasons they were concerned was an anxiety that there was an increasing evidence that the middle classes were moving their kids out of state education into private education. And so that was obviously part of the kind of third way debate that was going on at that time in that respect. The story is a complex one, and I'm not sure that I know all the detail, but the decision was made to create a particular new way of working that came to be known, and now is very well known, as the London Challenge. Now, I'm not going to tell you the full story of that because I only became involved in London Challenge in the latter period, but just to say, over the 5 years of London Challenge, only in the secondary sector, it was clear that remarkable progress was made in terms of the performance of secondary schools in the capital city. And the evidence of that is quite clear. There's lots of data on it, there's lots of independent evaluations, and of course the evaluation of the National Inspection team Ofsted. But I think possibly more significant as well as the improvement of the scores on the doors, if you like, was the strong evidence that the system had changed the way it goes about its business. Now, that is issue of how a system works is very much what I want us to think about here as we reflect on the next stage for developments here in Wales, really, in that respect. The evidence was so convincing that around about 2007, the then ministers decided that they would move forward with this idea of City Challenge, and they created the generic City Challenge programme, and that was to include continuation for another 3 years in London, but moving it into the primary sector, as well as a City Challenge in the West Midlands, what was called the Black Country Challenge, in 4 local authorities, and my involvement was in the Greater Manchester Challenge, which involved 10 local authorities in that respect, really. When I was invited to take on the task of Chief Advisor, which was around 2007, the formal start of City Challenge in Greater Manchester was in 2008, I spent quite a lot of time in London trying to find out what is it that had happened, what lessons could we learn that would be useful to us as we tried to create our own City Challenge programme, really. And of course, it's a complex story, as I said, and you know, I will never understand all the details, but certain things became evident from my engagement there. I spent time visiting some schools, I spent time talking to local authority officers, I spent time with the City Challenge advisors who'd worked, and I shadowed some of them around the schools, and I also talked to some academic colleagues who'd been monitoring what had gone on in that respect, really. And the central message that I took from all that engagement, and the idea that was really central to everything we tried to do in Greater Manchester, was that the strategy for London had been designed in London to fit the context of London. Now, I say that because it is central to everything that I want to argue, that if we underestimate the power of context, and that means many things, it means history, it means geography, it means transport, it means housing, it means culture and language, and all the things that make particular communities particular and special. If we ignore that and go for one-size-fits-all strategies, then of course we will quickly bump against the realities of what's happening on the local ground in that respect, really. So that was the central message that I took from London. The other thing to say about all that, I think history will look back at that period and see that as a remarkable thing in itself, because that London challenge occurred during a period of what was probably unprecedented centralisation of education policy in England. We had the national curriculum that had been introduced in '88, we had the national inspection system, we had national assessments, but we also had, at that period, the national strategies as well, that were effectively telling teachers how to plan their lessons. And we had what was called the 3-part lesson plan, you know, absolutely breathtaking, rocket science thinking, you know, a lesson has to have 3 parts, you know. But we had people hawking that idea around as if it was some sort of radical idea. Now, what happened in London was effectively the system was told, if you wish, you can push that aside and you can do something different. Clearly it's not working in London, that's why the schools are doing so badly. Let's see if we can innovate, let's see if we can experiment. And the fact that there was hands-on involvement of a minister in London was part of the way in which that space was created. In the early days, it was Stephen Twigg, but for most of the period of London Challenge, it was Andrew Adonis, who was very closely involved, taking even an interest in what was happening in particular schools in that respect. So when we took that simple idea up to Greater Manchester, the idea of starting with a contextual analysis, of course we also immediately faced the politics, you know, because there was an allocation of a very large amount of public money, £50 million. Now, government don't put £50 million into something unless they want to see quick action in that respect. But of course, in bringing that money to the table, they were also introducing an externally determined intervention into a situation where there were a lot of stakeholders, not least the 10 local authorities, which are effectively were being told, actually, you've failed. You know, you've not delivered, and so we're going to, almost it implied, push you aside and do something different. So it was hardly a good start in terms of trying to get a participatory sense of partnership in what we were trying to do in that respect. Let me say a little bit then about the context. It was a 3-year project starting in April 2008, raising the bar, closing the gap. That was effectively what the twin goals of the intervention were about. The Greater Manchester context, it's important for you to understand, it's a population of about 2.5 million people, incredibly diverse in all sorts of ways. They estimate, for example, in the city of Manchester, which is a relatively small local authority in terms of cities, they estimate that at the moment that over 150 languages are spoken in the city, and over 60% of Manchester children are bilingual. So you've got this very rich, complex cultural context in that respect. But you've also got, as can be seen from this display, which was developed by Save the Children, you've got most of the poorest wards in the United Kingdom are concentrated in Greater Manchester. So you've got some very intensive areas, mainly of white poverty on public housing estates. It says on this slide here that actually in the city of Manchester at this point, it's about 3 years ago, 27% of Manchester children were said to be living in poverty. And in some of the schools, it's not uncommon for 75% of children to be eligible for free school meals in that respect, really. So a very complex environment. About 1,150 schools in the 10 local authorities. So it is Manchester, but it's also Salford and Bolton and Bury and Rochdale and Stockport and Trafford. Local authorities, each with their own strong identity and strong sense of tradition, which was part of what was going on. From our initial contextual analysis, and I want to stress that contextual analysis is not an event or a state, it's an ongoing process because the context changed. But from our initial analysis, which initially, of course, was mainly based on statistics, but then as we got closer to the system, what we took for granted was that most, if not all, of the expertise that was needed to move this system forward, or this set of systems forward, if you prefer, was already there within Greater Manchester. And one of the things that I tried to do as I was, I suppose, the champion of the Greater Manchester Challenge, that wasn't the word we used, was I tried to create certain kinds of mantras, because what we were talking about was moving a whole system forward. And so the more people we could get involved, the more people who say, I feel part of it, the better. And of course, for many of the people I'm talking about, this wasn't central to their daily life. So we needed some kind of mantras. And one of the mantras I used was to say, I believe that the expertise we need is here, including the young people themselves, as we saw well illustrated this morning. And the task really is to move knowledge around. So we talked a lot about moving knowledge around. I also talked a lot about, this is not about doing more of the same. If it was, we would have put money into what already exists. This is about thinking about working in different ways. We have permission, and we had our own minister, Beverly Hughes, as an MP at that time in the Trafford Local Authority. We had our own MP, who was also very hands-on in the action, and Beverly was very much involved in some of the things that I did as the champion of the challenge. But Beverly was saying to us, we want you to find better ways of reaching the children that we can't reach in that respect. We had a team of challenge advisors, part-time, employed directly by the department, not by the local authorities. Almost all of them were former head teachers of schools in challenging contexts who had demonstrated tremendous skill in moving schools forward. They had an enormous amount of freedom and autonomy to innovate within the system, and they were encouraged to do that, whilst at the same time, of course, very much accountable because of the money that was being spent, the public money in that respect, really. Gradually, and it was very gradual, a series of interconnected strategies were developed to move knowledge around. It wasn't there at the beginning, it didn't come from London, it was created through the involvement of partners within the 10 local authorities, including the schools within those contexts in that respect. You can start anywhere on the diagram, but I'm going to start on your left-hand side with what we call the Keys to Success schools. The Keys to Success was a phrase that had been used in London, which had been, I think, coined by my counterpart there, Tim Brighouse, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And Tim had this idea that we have to stop talking about some schools as failing schools, or dysfunctional schools, or challenge schools. And he argued, these schools, in terms of system improvement, are the keys to success. If you can move these schools forward, that will have a trickle effect, will impact on thinking and expectations across the system. Over the 3 years, approximately 200 schools were designated as keys to success. In the early days, it wasn't a popular club to belong to, because despite the new language, people still, we know what you mean really. But in fact, eventually, it became a badge of honour, and some of the schools actually had it on their letterhead, because what happened to those 200 or so schools was, to varying degrees, but at a great pace, most of them made enormous progress, particularly in terms of the performance of their children in test and examinations. Now, most but not all of the schools were in the most disadvantaged areas of Greater Manchester. Many of them were in categories following on from the Ofsted inspection system, but not all. And not all of them were in the disadvantaged areas in that respect, really. Now, what happened in those 200 schools is very complex, and I am not in a position really to know exactly what happened, because what the challenge advisors did was to work with the schools to do an analysis of their context. What are the difficulties you're facing? What are the barriers that children are experiencing? What are the resources in your school and good practice in your school that can be mobilised to address those barriers in that respect? And another bit of language we used as part of the kind of creating a kind of common understanding was, our job is to get behind these schools. If these schools are going to improve, they're going to improve themselves. It's people in the schools will make the difference. Our job is to get behind them, and of course we had money and resources available to help us to do that. So the story of each of those schools is independent and discrete, but gradually something emerged that became vital to this refinement of the strategy, and almost by chance it emerged in London at the same time. What we found was the most powerful way of getting behind the Keys to Success school was to partner it with another school that had relative strengths in the areas that the Keys to Success school needed to develop. So the partnering of schools became crucial to the work of the challenge advisors. In almost every case, the partnership was with a school from another local authority. And that was, again, crucial to what I'm talking to you about. That it was actually working with a school that you don't normally have a relationship with, and therefore you're not in competition with in any sense, that seemed to help to create these partnerships working in that respect. Now, as we realised how powerful this was, then we worked hard at learning how to do it more effectively, because we had no manual, we had no previous experience we could build upon. We were saying, let's learn how to do this. And effectively, my team of Challenge Advisor colleagues became like a dating agency, working out whether strengths in the local area could be used to address the challenges in particular schools. From our monitoring of that work, something else emerged, which is absolutely crucial to all of this. What we found was that in many cases, the impact was on both schools in the partnership. That in many instances, the so-called strong school was gaining benefit from being in a partnership with a low-attaining school. It's almost kind of counterintuitive, but we have plenty of evidence to show that that was the pattern. Not every time, of course, but in many cases. And there's certainly many head teachers in Greater Manchester who would tell you that with absolute confidence in that respect. On the right side of the diagram, we created what was called families of schools. Again, this was a phrase borrowed from London. It was based on a quite sophisticated data system, a bit like the system you have in Wales here, but more sophisticated, if I'm honest, and more detailed. And effectively, we created groups of schools, families, across border again, vital to all of this. We had 58 primary families and we had 11 secondary families. The schools were grouped on the basis that they were schools that were serving similar communities. So effectively, your school would be a partner with maybe 10 or 12 or 15 schools from across Greater Manchester that were serving similar communities. We used resources as an incentive to encourage those schools to work together. Some of the families worked very well and had a very powerful impact. Some of them were less successful, some of them hardly got going. I guess there wasn't enough time, but I'm convinced there's something in that idea. Having groupings of schools from different communities, working together, using evidence, statistical evidence, but also intelligence, local intelligence, to think about how the strengths within the family can be used to help all the schools to move forward in that respect. I think there is potential in all of that, and I'll come back to it in a few moments in that respect. Down at the bottom, we had a thing called the work strands. If I'm truthful, part of the reason to have these work strands was to encourage the local authorities to feel that they had a role in what, as I've already described, was an externally driven intervention. The local authorities were encouraged to develop initiatives, projects, work strands, we call them, around themes that seem to be important across the system. The involvement of parents, the involvement of governors, raising aspirations, factors like that, if you will. Some of that money, if I'm absolutely truthful, was wasted. It led to what traditionally tends to be the case when local authorities set up those partnerships. A lot of talking and not much action, and therefore not much impact. But we learnt something from that, which is absolutely crucial. And if I had my time again, in the sense I'm having a bit of time again here in Wales, I would say there's something else we have to add into the mix. This is about what goes on in classrooms, first and foremost. It is about what goes on in the school. It is what happens between schools, the partnerships between schools. But it has to be about what goes on beyond the school gate. It has to involve the parents. It has to involve the community. And as we started to do our contextual analysis in that respect, the possibilities were endless. 4 universities in Greater Manchester, all saying to us, we work with schools, but we could do more. 2 massively rich football clubs who were saying to us, we work with schools, but we could do more. The BBC, the Halley Orchestra, lots of other sports organisations, arts organisations, faith organisations, voluntary organisations, all involved, but all saying they could do more. Now, I think in the mix of a system change, particularly in relation to challenging the issue of poverty, you have to go beyond the school gate. And I would say that has to be part of the formula. At the top of the diagram was what we called our leadership strategy. We were conscious that many of this kind of large-scale, heavily funded initiatives fade quickly soon after the money disappears. That's been the evidence of studies, particularly in North America, in that respect. We came to the conclusion that part of the solution to this was to ensure that the leadership came from within the system. And so it was head teachers themselves, more than anything, gradually took over the project and took over the initiative. It was head teachers who became system leaders. And those of you who are in the education system in Wales will perhaps realise that that phrase here in Wales, mistakenly in my view, has been used to describe people who are not in schools, but people who support schools. System leadership has to come from within the schools. And part of the changes that are there now, it was in the Hill Review and it's in the national model, is that actually it's head teachers who have to become the system leaders in that respect. Now, towards the third year and in the third year of the challenge in Greater Manchester, most of the coordination of all of this, the moving of knowledge around, was taken over by successful head teachers. And in fact, they created an agency. I think this is partly what the Deputy Minister was talking about, called By Schools, For Schools. You can look at its website if you wish. And they, to this day, 3 years later, coordinate the moving of knowledge around in Greater Manchester. At the centre of the diagram was, in some ways, what I found to be the greatest challenge within the challenge. What I'm describing is a new way of thinking about system improvement. It's been called by eminent professor in England, David Hargreaves, the self-improving system. It's a system that has the capacity to improve itself, with knowledge being moved around and coordination coming from within the system. It begs the question, certainly in England, do you need a local authority? And in the political debate in England across the parties, that is a serious question that's still being asked. My own view is you do need a local authority. You need an organisation that has the big system, the big picture. An organisation that acts as the conscience of the system, that keeps an eye on things, that makes sure that despite all our good intentions and our values, we're not colluding with one another to overlook the groups of learners that are always overlooked in that respect, really in that respect. But it's a very different kind of local authority, not one that controls or leads, one that watches and enables and facilitates. Clearly there are implications for this here in Wales. There's lots of data. We could spend a lot of time looking at it because the whole thing has been evaluated. Can we just show the rest of that slide? Can you go back? Sorry. Oh, we've lost the data. Okay, it doesn't matter. Okay, go on to the next slide. There's lots of data, and you can find the evaluation if you just Google City Challenge evaluation. The impact in London and in Greater Manchester was very significant and is demonstrably there in the analysis in that respect. But what I'd say about Greater Manchester, as I said earlier about London, is the system now does its business in a different way. And so I can draw out some lessons, which are what I'm describing as a way of thinking, no more than that, right? And I'd say this wherever I was working. And over the last 18 months, I've had the privilege to work with colleagues in Anglesey, where there's been some very interesting developments. And now I'm working here in this region with Central South Wales, with the 5 local authorities, trying to apply this thinking in a way that fits those very different contexts. Anglesey and Central South Wales obviously are very different in that respect. I start from the assumption the expertise is there. It's there in the system. We don't need to look outside. Including, as we saw so beautifully presented this morning, the young people themselves as a resource, really. Therefore, we need means of moving the knowledge around. We need effective networking systems so that people have a greater awareness of where the strengths are within the context in which they're working. So it's creating networking arrangements. I think then, because schools do and will go through periods of difficulties, sometimes there is a need for more intensive partnerships. Pairs of schools. In the primary sector in Greater Manchester, towards the end of the challenge, we often had trios of schools, and there are certain benefits in that respect, really. So these carefully brokered partnerships, I think themselves, have to be part of the mix. No, you've lost the slide. What's happened to the other slide? Okay, you lost the other slide. Okay, no, to go back from that one. Go back. There's 2 other things. You've got it on your handout. I hope. I think there's 5 things on the slide. The leadership from this has to come from within schools. So this has very important implications for head teachers and other senior people in the schools, and indeed school governors, I have to say, in relation to all of this. But I'd also want to emphasise the point of linking with the wider communities. And of course, all of this has to have implications for the way in which the district administration in Wales, the local authorities work in that respect, really. It's essentially a social process. That's why an event like this is so important. It's not just about the professional educators, it's about everybody else in the community who has a vested interest in the development of education. So I conclude by saying the most important lesson is the need to have a collective view, the collective will to make it happen. Thank you very much.